As the Honourable Member for Halifax Needham.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you for this opportunity to speak to Bill 15. I won't speak for a long time. I think as a number of people have, a number of members have already commented, really we don't know a lot about what this bill will mean. I went through, and I know we're not allowed props in the House, but I highlighted all the times that regulations appeared in the bill, and it is many times in many different sentences that clearly are the guts of the bill. The guts of the bill, the meaning of this bill will be determined in the regulations. Who can participate, how they can sell, how credits will be issued. Virtually everything will be created by the regulations and or determined by the minister. And so as a relatively new member of this House, I guess I'm left feeling a little bit frustrated that we're not trusting this House and its members to truly shape how Nova Scotia is responding to the greatest challenge of our time. I think in this case we're also, frankly, really counting on the leadership of the federal government. And isn't that odd? We pat ourselves on the back in this House so much, to some extent justifiably on all sides, for leadership, the work that Nova Scotia has already done. And now we're saying, okay, and now we're going to, whatever else we're going to do, it's going to be at the behest of the federal government to meet what is required of us and as determined in the regulations. And instead of this House really grappling with this situation before us and taking action. Yeah, I find that disappointing. As the urgency of climate change increases, it seems that the political courage in this House has waned. I recommend to all members to listen to the Springtide podcast, Off the Script, the interview with Mark Parent about how the Environmental Goals and Sustainable Prosperity Act came to actually be enacted. And I found it quite fascinating. Particularly given how often that act is referenced and how much, again, all parties take some credit for that moment 10 years ago when this House was so forward-looking. And it made me realize that what we all must do, I think, as we try to show leadership with Nova Scotians outside this House who want us to show leadership, that we must be ready for the moment to present itself when there's an opening and there's some space to move forward. And it strikes me in this House right now, we're not at that moment between an opposition which sees any action, so far as I can tell, on climate change as a tax grab, and frankly a government where this does not appear to be a priority. So I wish the Minister of Environment well in sneaking some stuff into the regulations, and maybe that's the best that we can hope for right now. The NDP's proposed amendments would have strengthened this bill. They would have helped to put money in the Green Fund, both to foster innovation and increased adaptation to climate change, and also to help to direct much of those funds to low-income and moderate-income Nova Scotians. And that is what we must be doing as we address climate change. There is no option but to grapple with the reality that we are in, and one significant part of that reality is that some of us are far more able to adapt than others. Frankly, I would welcome financial incentives to encourage some of my fellow members who drive from far reaches of Nova Scotia to maybe not drive such big trucks all by themselves on the 100 series highways. Maybe they would get a Lexus if there was a financial incentive, in the form of a carbon tax, or get a hybrid or something. I recognize that not everybody can ride their bicycle from the North End, as I sometimes do. But change, almost nobody embraces change. I think everyone who has been in government has grappled with that. And yet, leadership is about helping change to happen in a positive direction. One of my big concerns about this approach in this bill is that I fear that the government is granting a golden egg, or perhaps even a goose that will lay one into the future on a regular basis, to big emitters, because so far as I understand the bill, we are granting the initial allocations of carbon for free to the big emitters. And why? Why? They're exacting a cost from us all in terms of what they are doing to our environment. They recognize, I would say in general, they recognize that the way of the future is to innovate and to reduce, and that is just increasing their business models. And yet there's going to be this public subsidy, effectively, for them. It reminds me of growing up in Newfoundland. There was this whole cohort of business owners who were kind of purported to be great entrepreneurs and forward thinkers, or just like really successful, wealthy folks. In my town in particular, some of them moved in the same circles as my father, who had turned down an opportunity to get an early cable license. And those cable licenses were allocated either at very low cost or for free, because nobody knew that a cable license was going to be worth anything. People couldn't imagine what that would look like in the future. And then, so by the time I was 15 years old and it was 20 years on, the folks who were smart enough or had the right friends to get in on that cable license deal were driving the big cars and kind of the big shots around town. And I just kind of wonder, are the folks who are going to be getting this allocation, are they going to be patting themselves on the back for no particular service to our community or to our province's economy? To respond a little bit to some of the concerns raised by the member for Shelburne, have I got that right? Pardon? Queen Shelburne, thank you very much. And I really do hear those concerns, and I have some of the concerns too about seniors who are struggling with heating costs. How unfortunate that we are not unifying our voices to ask for real revenue generation with this bill, to put money into a green fund to address the needs of low-income Nova Scotians and innovate and pay for younger Nova Scotians to do that work. So that's part of my response to that. But then my other response is that things have changed in certain ways in our economy and in our society, and they will have to change again as we again adjust to this reality that is bigger than us and from which there's no fleeing, but there is adapting. And I think about an opportunity I had to travel in Ireland when I had just graduated from university. I was, in my very, very early 20s. And I went to stay with a family on a farm who my father had stayed with some 20 years earlier. And at the end of the meal, so there was a fire. There was a fire and a stove in the kitchen, and the fire and the stove in the kitchen heated some heaters up in the bedrooms, and I wanted to retreat to the bedroom where I was staying to write in my journal or something, and they're like, no, we don't turn those on until after we dampen the fire in the kitchen, and then we turn on the fire in the living room. And basically everybody always had to be in one room, because there was only ever one room at a time that was warm. And yet there was no sense of deprivation. There was a great sense of community, a great sense of hearth, a great sense of continuity, and I expect that house hadn't changed very much in the 20 years between when my father had spent time and when I did. It's now, again, about 20 years later, and I wonder if, like many Canadian households, that house has been expanded several times over, because we know that, in general, Canadians are living in much larger homes than they were, certainly than the house that I live in with my partner and my 2 kids is, maybe it's about the same square footage as the house where my grandparents raised 9. And so we know that, in general, Canadian houses have increased, Canadian household sizes have gone down, and that change has happened over a couple of decades, and I think we all know from the many conversations that we have in this house, that doesn't necessarily in and of itself mean that we are better off. But it has in general meant that we are living a more carbon-intensive lifestyle, and again, that will have to change. And I find it disappointing when the conversation in this house does not encourage the forward looking view of how can that change be positive. What are the good things that we can look towards? I think certainly one of the things that has changed over the past number of decades across Canada, and certainly Nova Scotia is no exception, is the increase in inequality. And that is something that this bill, if it were fortified with revenue generation through meaningful sales of carbon allocations, could be addressing by investing money in the Green Fund, and again, hearkening back to the NDP proposed amendments, investing or spending much of that Green Fund on lower income Nova Scotians to help them adjust and adapt. Instead, it's not clear to me where any funds for the Green Fund will come, or how it will become a significant player. We know, that change is hard, at least when you contemplate it before you're into it. Maybe change is hard to sell. Maybe that's what it is, actually. But change actually has meant jobs in Nova Scotia. We have some 1,300 people working in efficiency in the province. And many more people working in a range of different companies, working on innovation, working on renewable energy, and even doing other things that you can see as being tied to some kind of low carbon future. In my own district, I just attended the opening of the Halifax Tool Library, and that's the Tool Library opened a couple years ago, but it just moved to Veith House, where I used to be the executive director, and Veith House has been around that particular building was built to replace an orphanage which was destroyed in the Halifax explosion. And as executive director, one of the things that completely overwhelmed me was going down to that basement and seeing how full it was of stuff. And now it's been magically transformed into the Halifax Tool Library, which takes donated tools, concentrates them in a community workshop so that anybody can pay a very small fee and have access to those tools, as well as gatherings and workshop space. Instead of having to have the bigger house with the wired, garage or the wired workshop, you can actually come together with people and have access to something without owning it and pursue that activity with other people, so that your actual well-being increases. And I think of that as really a sign of how things may be, where change might be hard to sell, but when you're in it, you're like, oh, this isn't so bad. I'm changing with other people. I'm getting to know other people. Same as another way that some folks in Halifax, Needham make a living, and maybe it's a modest one. I know it's a modest one, but is by, being involved with the Halifax Music Co-op, where again, like a whole bunch of people coming together and making sure that people can learn music really affordably and doing wonderful, wonderful shows together. You have the Big Sing, which is a gathering where every 2 weeks people come together and they sing a song. The next time up, it's going to be Bob Cajun in tribute to Gord Downie. All of these things are kind of low carbon fun, and they are initiatives that weren't around 10, 15 years ago. But I tell you, a lot of young, often relatively modestly employed residents of Halifax Needham are seeing the future, and they're finding ways to make living that change relatively pleasant. And so I wish that this House would show leadership again on that front. And I also wish that the government would seek out ways with a whole of government approach to really figure out how it has to change. And there are so many different ways. I go back to the loss, effectively, of Thrive, which has now been relegated to, no offense to the minister, to Communities, Culture and Heritage, and where it's now considered a sport program, whereas at one point it was looking at how the provincial government sites buildings and does built infrastructure to encourage activity, to encourage active transportation, to encourage greater health, and to encourage a low-carbon transition. The siting of the outpatient clinic in Bayers Lake flies straight in the face of that strategy. And I know, because I heard rumblings out of the bureaucracy, young public servants, young as in like my age, I'm recognizing I'm no longer young, but public servants of my generation were just like fuming that so much work went into doing the analysis of what is required from the government to demonstrate change, and then it was like all that advice just was frittered away and an opportunity lost. Sightings of public buildings in, equidistant to two different towns because you don't want to pick one or the other, and therefore folks from both communities need to drive. I mean, school sightings in Nova Scotia are a classic example of that, where basically we've beggared two towns because there's a lack of political courage and yes, maybe a lack of resources, but even long-term future, wouldn't it be better to figure out how to place smaller schools in town so that people can walk to them and they can provide all the different services that a hub school can. So there's all kinds of ways that we could be transitioning, we could be showing and demonstrating that change is not awful. It's just sometimes hard to imagine, and if we do it together, it doesn't have to be unpleasant. So I don't see evidence of that in here. I will, I guess, wait like many other people to see the regulations, and I look forward to the day in the House when I'll see us all maybe come together in, as EGSBA magically made it happen 10 years ago, to again show some real leadership. Thank you very much.